we're looking this morning, I think, what can be called the first ever Christmas carol. And it's really this passage has two songs, really one song, but then Elizabeth kind of, her exclamation and what she says to Mary is also kind of a song, or at least it's poetic. And so maybe we'll call it a Christmas carol and a piece of poetry. And I think it's worth asking the question, why a song, right? Why does Mary sing a song? Or maybe even broader, the bigger question, why does Scripture have so many times where there's both a story followed by a song, or there's narrative that also then is followed up with music? So in the Old Testament, God brings the Israelites through the Red Sea and delivers them from the hand of the Egyptians and destroys the Egyptians. And so we read the story, and then right after that it's followed by a song. And so you might look at that and say, why is it necessary to have the song and the story as well? And I think that's actually a really important question to ask. The answer, I think, can be found in a person named Dwight Schrute, which, if you've watched The Office, you'll know who Dwight Schrute is. He's one of these characters that's he's a rule follower. He's kind of a square. He's really likes to make sure everybody else is following all the procedures in the office. Anyways, in one episode of the TV show The Office, it's Kelly Kapoor's birthday. And it's Dwight's job to decorate the office. And some of you will remember this. Dwight decides he's going to hang up a banner. And do you remember what the banner says? It kind of got sort of famous. Dwight decides on this banner, on this birthday, instead of putting, happy birthday and, an exclamation point and all that sort of poetic stuff, he puts a sentence. He puts, "It is your birthday," period. And classic scene, right? But here's why I draw your attention to that, right? Dwight is what he's doing is he's telling the story. He's writing out, the narrative, as it were. He's giving you the facts. Normally, what you expect in a case like that is the poetry, the lyrics, the singing. And so, Mary, after the visit from Gabriel, Mary very easily could have said, God is going to save his people through his son Jesus that I'm going to give birth to. She could have just written that as story. But a song does such a better job of expressing the power. In other words, Mary even says, my soul, right, this deep part of who I am, my soul magnifies the Lord and my spirit rejoices in God. And so music and poetry have this way of tapping into and expressing part of ourselves that narrative doesn't always capture. Songs are important for God's people. They capture something that words just don't express. And so what we're going to do this morning is, as I said, we're really looking at, it's kind of like 1.5 songs. There's really the Song of Mary. That's where I want us to focus most of our attention this morning. But Elizabeth also has this poetic exclamation that she says to Mary. It's sort of a blessing upon Mary. And I want us to look at what are these two songs, or this song and this poetry, what does it display to us? What does it describe for us about God's work of salvation? Now, we're picking up the story, and of course we have to remember that the story is linked to the one before it, or this passage is linked to the one before it. In verse 38 of Luke chapter 1, Mary has just finished hearing the news from Gabriel the angel that she's going to give birth to this child, and she's pregnant. And on the one hand, we hear that and we assume she's excited because I think the text sort of leads us to think that she's just in awe of this. But she ends by saying, may this be to me as God has willed. May this happen according to God's plan. And so Mary she's submitting. She's submissive to God's will. She's placing herself under God's plan, which is good. That's what you are supposed to do. But you wonder, at what point does it begin to sink in what this really means for her? From a human point of view, and I emphasize that, from a human point of view, Mary's life has completely changed in ways that it will never go back to what it once was. Whatever hopes and dreams and ambitions and goals and desires that Mary had wanted to get out of life, all of that is gone now. because Mary is about to give birth to a child. Well, about to. I mean, it's 9 months, but she's going to be pregnant, and in that culture, of course, that was, if you were not married, that was a huge stigma. And so Mary knows, she's beginning to realize, no doubt, that from that point on, she's likely to be ostracized and excluded from the broader community. People will be talking and whispering about her behind her back. She probably begins to realize that she'll forever have to live with that reputation that should not be seen in a positive light. And I'm just imagining, and I have to be careful, we have to be careful, because the text doesn't spell this out for us, but we have to imagine that this is beginning to sink in for Mary. Now, why does she go to Elizabeth? Elizabeth, sometimes we read that she's Mary's cousin. Probably, the text doesn't use the actual word for cousin, it just says that she's a relative. So we don't actually know what the relationship was. I have a feeling, just given the age gap, Mary's really young and Elizabeth is really old. It's maybe more like an aunt, but the text isn't clear. But in any case, Mary, she goes to Elizabeth, her relative. And it's kind of like, well, why would she do that? They lived about 70 miles apart, so it's not like you just jump in your car and drive an hour and a half. I mean, this is like a couple of days' journey. I don't know how often Mary would have seen Elizabeth in the ordinary course of life. Maybe once or twice a year, maybe not even that often. I'm just kind of thinking when all Jewish people would gather in Jerusalem, maybe that would be an occasion to see your extended relatives. But it's not like Mary and Elizabeth lived next door. Well, I think the answer to the question, why visit Elizabeth, I think it's found when Gabriel is announcing the message to Mary. He drops a hint of sorts. He says, oh, by the way, your cousin or your relative Elizabeth is also going to have a baby. And maybe that just leads Mary to say, well, here's someone having a common experience. Let me go and see her. And that's what she does. Now, it's possible, again, that as she's going, there's maybe that little part of her that thinks, what is Elizabeth going to think? How is Elizabeth going to look at me as that unwed pregnant mother? Maybe, again, the text isn't clear, so we have to be really careful, but it's possible that Mary is perhaps fearful that she's going to be judged even by her relative. When she gets there, what she hears from Elizabeth would forever change her, I think. She doesn't hear maybe what she would have expected. Now, before we get into that, I think it's worth just noting for a moment that, well, church history has looked at Mary in a couple of different ways. Right? You know that in the history of the church that, especially among, well, Roman Catholics and among Lutherans, not all Lutherans, but some Lutherans, there's the doctrine of what's called the Immaculate Conception. And that's the idea that Mary was born sinless. She doesn't have a sinful nature, and therefore she has never sinned ever in her entire life. There's some in church history and tradition who believe that, and therefore Mary is put on a huge pedestal. She's lifted up because she's unlike every other human being in that she has never sinned and can't sin. Now, Protestants, on the other hand, and that includes us in the Reformed tradition, Protestants kind of tend to go to the other side, in which they say, well, no, we don't want to put Mary on a pedestal, and so we don't treat Mary any differently than anyone else. Right? Protestants kind of, it's like, Mary who? Right? And so we avoid putting Mary on any kind of a pedestal and giving any kind of special treatment. I think what Mary hears when she enters into the house of her relative not only challenges both of those assumptions, but it paints an important picture of Mary. The first thing you'll notice, in verse 41, when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaps for joy. And verse 42, Elizabeth says, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child that you will bear." Elizabeth right away affirms the place that Mary holds. She recognizes that Mary is being used by God and has been chosen by God for a very particular and very honored role in God's work of redemption. Right? So Mary, in fact, Mary goes on to affirm that in her own song when she says in verse 47, or pardon me, in verse 48, from now on, all generations will call me blessed. And that's true. Mary has been given a unique honor in the history of the church, right? In the history of God's work of salvation. However, Mary also says, and this is again taken from Mary's song, in verse 47, she says, my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. Now, if Mary were sinless and perfect, and if she'd never sinned or done anything wrong, and if she didn't have a sinful nature, then why does she need a Savior? See, that challenges the other side as well. That challenges this idea that Mary was sinless. Mary, however, was chosen by God to play a part in God's redemptive history, and she holds a place of at least honor, though not worship or veneration as other traditions treat her. But you'll notice the exclamation of Elizabeth. She honors Mary. So Mary, if she's expecting that she's going to be receive criticism from her relative, whatever she might be expecting, whatever uncertainty she may have had until that point, all of that changes because Elizabeth pronounces this blessing, this benediction upon her. God has chosen her as a part of His redemptive work in human history. Now, that leads us into the heart of Mary's song. Mary hears this and then she sings about it. She expresses the beauty of God's work of salvation. Now, the song itself, if you kind of follow through the themes of the song, it focuses on really two main ideas that are tied together. The first is that God humbles the exalted, and the second is related to it. God lifts up those who are humbled, or He exalts the humbled. Right? So that's kind of the big picture theme. God humbles the exalted, and He exalts the humbled. He brings down those who are high and brings up those who are low. Now there's a lot of ways I think that can be misunderstood and has been misunderstood. Sometimes people focus so much on what we call them the social implications of this, that God is somehow looks at all the people of any kind of wealth or power in the world, and God just wants to knock them off their throne and bring them down. He wants to go after those who are in positions of power and importance in society. And at the same time, He wants to go to those who are down on the margins of society and bring them up. And that's what the gospel is. It's just this sort of social, trying to make all things equal in society. Now others hear that and say, wait a minute, that's not what this is about at all. This is a spiritual thing. God is really interested in those who are spiritually prideful, and He wants to humble them, and those who are spiritually humble, those are the ones that He lifts up. Has nothing to do with the society as a whole. But again, two kind of opposite extremes. And what I want to suggest is that neither of those really capture what this is about. This is what God does with us spiritually, but it has social implications. And I'll show you how we get there. Look with me, if you would, at verse 51. Verse 51, I think, is kind of captures the theme of this. It's God who scatters those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. Now that's a very appropriate description of pride. Pride is what happens in your inmost thoughts. Pride is what happens in your heart of hearts. Pride is what happens when you kind of puff yourself up by looking at something in yourself. Something that maybe you've accomplished, something maybe you've done. Pride is a lot like a puffer fish. Right? You all know puffer fishes. Those are like those small little fish. But what do? When they feel threatened, they take in an enormous amount of air, and what they do is they make themselves look a lot bigger and a lot more threatening than they really are. But it's all just air, right? It's kind of false. They're not really that big. They're not really that intimidating. They just look that way. And pride in your inmost thoughts can work a lot like that. Pride looks at what you have and says, look at the amount of money that I earn. Look at the position that I occupy. Look at the accomplishments in my own life. Look at what a good person I am. And with every look at, it's taking another breath in and becoming puffed up. I don't know how big I can puff myself up here, but you get the idea. Pride is that puffer fish. It's looking at the things that you have, that you've done, and it's becoming big in your own mind. Now, Mary's song, she goes on, and she focuses on two key ways that through all history and throughout all cultures, two key ways that people have so often puffed themselves up. Verse 52, it has to do with power. He's brought down rulers from their thrones, right? The people who are puffed up because of their positions of power and authority. And then verse 53, he's filled the hungry with good things, but the rich he sends away empty. Wealth. Those who are puffed up because of their wealth. How much they own. How much they earn. What kind of house, car, vacations, etc. How much stuff do they have? People that puff themselves up or who are prideful in their inmost thoughts because of their money. That leads them to boast in themselves. Now, money and power are two of the biggest ones. And you'll find them in just about every culture and about every place throughout all of human history. But they're not the only ones. In fact, I would say to us, it's interesting, wherever you go, it's sort of like each culture and each subculture has its own things that they look to puff themselves up. You go to some places in the country and it might be appearance, the fashion, what do you wear? How do you look? How attractive are you? You go to other places, it might be education. How smart are you? How many degrees do you have? What school did you graduate from? Other places, it's, who do you know? How well are you connected? I think here in the Northwest, this is just my own observation. I think one of the things that we puff ourselves up with is how tolerant can we be? How accepting can we be of how many people? But the irony is, you see what happens, and this is true across the board. Whether it's money or appearance or power or, morality, we puff ourselves up, but it destroys us in the process because, you start to say, well, look how tolerant I am. I'm accepting of everyone. And then the next step is, and you aren't. You aren't as tolerant as me. You aren't as wealthy as me. You aren't as connected as me. You aren't as educated as me. And it creates this sense of pride that we use to push other people down in our own minds. And that's why the gospel comes as such good news. Because the gospel comes along to those who are, in the eyes of the world, who don't have what the world says you need to have in order to be significant. The gospel comes along and says, guess what? God doesn't deal with you on the basis of your income. He doesn't deal with you on the basis of your position. He doesn't deal with you on the basis of your number of degrees or anything else. The gospel comes along and says God deals with you on the basis of Christ. Right? That's what Mary is already beginning to look forward to. That's what she's already beginning to anticipate. God doesn't care about all the things that the world uses to puff themselves up with. You might be interested to know that the church in many cases in the southern hemisphere, places like Brazil that are otherwise deal with a lot of poverty, places in Africa as well, and Asia, many places in Asia, the church is growing exponentially in these places. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, but one of those reasons is that people hear that message, and otherwise they're poor. They live in favelas in Brazil, and they live in the slums, and along comes the gospel and says, God doesn't care about the amount of money that you make. You might be marginalized and weak and oppressed and ignored in the eyes of the world, but that's not how God sees you. The gospel lifts up those who are humbled in the eyes of the world. The gospel elevates those that the world has humbled. But guess what? The flip side of this is every bit as true. The gospel humbles those that the world exalts. The gospel humbles those that the world exalts. Now, I think there's two pieces to that. The first piece is that there are sometimes that people who puff themselves up with power, wealth, and they use it to oppress and manipulate and control others. Sometimes what God does is He exposes the sins behind that. And we sometimes say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Sometimes people who've puffed themselves up with power, wealth, etc., sometimes God has this way of just knocking them off their pedestal. If you followed what's happened, say, in Hollywood in the Me Too movement, that's just one example. Right? People have used their power to control and do horrible things to others, and God exposes that and brings them low. But there's another way as well. The gospel's not just good news for the poor and the downtrodden and the down and out. The gospel is also good news for those who get swept up in this rat race of always trying to have enough and earn enough and make enough and keep their position. Because you know what happens? You get swept up in that, and you never quite feel like you've made it. You never quite feel like you're earning enough. It's always like, well, I got a big promotion, and well, that's great for a little bit, but then pretty soon you think, well, I got to go higher yet, and I got to earn more again. You reach one milestone, and then you start getting restless for the next. And the gospel comes along there and says, guess what? God doesn't measure you on all those things that the world measures you by. I'll give you an example. You might remember the story of Naaman in the Old Testament. Naaman, it's a fascinating story because in today's language we'd say Naaman was like a 4-star general. He was in a position of importance, respected by the whole culture around him, at least for his title and his position. He was wealthy. Then he gets sick. It's a terminal illness, leprosy. And he's desperate for help. So he, kind of a long story short, he seeks help ultimately from God. And God essentially says through the prophet Elisha, He says, okay, Naaman, I can make you well. You need to go take a dip in the Jordan River. Now, to understand the Jordan River, we look at the Willamette River and we think, I wouldn't want to get, anywhere close to that. It's dirty. The Willamette River is like pristine waters compared to what the Jordan was, like dirty and sewage and all that. Why would God do that? Well, because God wasn't so much after, God could have just said, sure, Naaman, you're healed. But what God was trying to do was to bring humility to Naaman, making Naaman realize that it's not his status and his position and his standing in the world, all those things that the world idolizes. God was bringing him low. And indeed, that's what happens. Naaman, first he says, I'm not going near that river. And God says, okay. And eventually he realizes if he wants to get well, he's got to do what God is telling him to do. And so he does eventually, and he's healed. Not just of the leprosy, but he sees God, how God deals with even those who are in positions of power. He sort of strips them of their reliance on the things of this world. Paul gets that in Philippians. Right? Paul says, I've got this pedigree, I'm well educated, I'm as moral as they come, I've got all the right family linkage and family connections, but I had to realize that all that stuff wasn't worth a pile of garbage compared to knowing Christ. That's the gospel. It humbles those that the world exalts, and it exalts those that the world humbles. Now, what do you do about this? How do we live in response? If that's really what the gospel is about, I think there's two things that I want us to focus on this morning. The first is this. You look at verse 46 and 47. My soul glorifies the Lord. My soul rejoices in God, my Savior. Some texts use the language, my soul magnifies God, which is like saying my soul looks at God and I want to make Him loom large, and I want Him to be, you might say, enormous in my heart and in my mind. One of the ways that I think we magnify God is by looking at and seeing and giving value to the things that God values. Which is a way of saying, well, I'll give you just a reference from the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 20, the early church is coming around and they're talking together. They're sort of having a church meeting, and they're trying to determine how do we live out the gospel? How do we live in obedience to God? And one of the things that they say is we must help those who are weak. We must help those who are weak. And the interesting thing is the word weak there is the same word that's used here in Mary's song. It's like really what happens is the early church comes along and says, if God humbles those who are exalted and exalts those who are humbled, then we too must care for those who in the eyes of the world are marginalized and oppressed and ignored and overlooked. We've got to share and we've got to align ourselves with the values of God. You know, even here in Salem and this part of the country, you can look at all kinds of social concerns, things that are, you know, people who are marginalized and overlooked. You look at the victims of sex trafficking. You look at those who are in foster care. You look at refugees that have been resettled here in Salem. You look at the homeless in our community. These are marginalized people, people that the world looks at and says, they really have nothing to bring. And as Christians, our calling, if we magnify God, if we make large the things that matter to Him, I think we're going to help those who are weak. Now, I realize that in some ways this can be sort of used as a bludgeon or a club. Like, you're not doing enough. Go out there and be better with the poor and so on. That's not how Mary approaches any of this. That's not how our text shows us. In fact, the second thing that I want to show you in response is if you look at verse 50, Mary extends an invitation. She says, God's mercy extends to those who fear Him from generation to generation. In other words, God's mercy is for those who fear God. It's God's mercy that changes us. It's God's mercy that leads to a different way of living. How do we experience God's mercy? Well, Mary says it's for those who fear Him. Now, we have a sort of a relationship with fear, an understanding of fear that's not always biblical. Or at least when we read it in the Bible, we read our modern understanding into it, right? We think of fear, we think of like Halloween and horror movies. Biblically, fear is really different from that. It's not being scared exactly. It's a couple things. The best way I can explain it is like if you visited the Grand Canyon. Some of you have been there and you know that it's one of the most impressive sights that I've seen on the face of the earth. It's amazing. And when you see it, you see the beauty and the majesty of this incredible sight in front of you. And really what you just want to do is there's a part of you that just wants to get closer and closer, and you want to see it and just consume it with your eyes. You want to take it all in. But as you get closer and closer, you also see that, number one, there are no safety railings really anywhere. They want to keep it as natural as possible, so they don't have like big fences up all over the place. You also see these signs everywhere that tell you about, this person decided they'd try to hike the whole canyon in one day and they didn't make it out alive. And this person didn't drink enough water and they didn't make it out alive. And so it creates this awareness that if you don't respect the elements, as it were, if you don't respect this canyon, it will destroy you. As beautiful as it is, as awesome as it is, if you don't take it seriously, it will destroy you. It will kill you. Biblically, I think that gets us close to the idea of what it is to fear God. God in His glory and in His majesty and His awesomeness, His beauty, His holiness is something so great and so awesome. But at the same time, if you treat it flippantly, if you treat it casually, if you diminish what it is, it will destroy you. So what do you do? How do you and I, as sinful people, come into the presence of God and approach the presence of God in a way that doesn't destroy us? How do we experience the mercy of God? Well, the text, of course, hints at that. If you look at verse 52 and 53, it talks about God bringing down the rulers and lifting up the humble. Right? This reversal, this way of reversal that God enacts. And of course, that points us to the greatest reversal in which the King of glory Himself, the King of all majesty and power and might, leaves His throne. Not because He's being knocked off, not because He's being deposed, but because He's willingly setting that aside and He's coming down into our world. And He comes into our world. He's humbled to the point of being born in a manger, in a stable, into poverty. Right? He's humbled and he's empty. He empties himself willingly. Why? So that you and I might be lifted up. So that you and I, through his work on the cross, might be brought near into God's presence. So that you and I might be fed. So that you and I might be filled with good things. That's what the gospel is all about. And when we experience that gospel, when we grasp the depth of our own brokenness and our own sin and our own undeserving, and when we see that God emptied himself so that we might be filled and humbled himself so that we might be lifted up, that changes you. That sends you and I forth on a willingness and a readiness to align ourselves with the message and the good news of God's kingdom, that God humbles those who are exalted in the eyes of the world and exalts those who are humbled